This week on Physio Foundations, we're launching a series of episodes called Clinical Anatomy. So anatomy is one of my favourite topics and a favourite part of my working week as a physiotherapy educator. And to help me launch this series, I'm talking to another really well-known and credentialed and equally passionate anatomy educator, Associate Professor Michelle Lazarus. Welcome to the Physio Foundations podcast, the podcast about the knowledge and skills that provide the foundation of expert clinical practice. So I'm honoured to have Associate Professor Michelle Lazarus on the podcast this week to launch this series of clinical anatomy episodes. So Michelle's the director of the Monash Centre for Human Anatomy Education, the deputy head of department in education for anatomy and developmental biology within the Biomedical Discovery Institute. And Michelle's also the curriculum integration network lead within the Monash Uni Centre Scholarship in Health Education. So in other words, Michelle is also a highly experienced educator, an anatomy educator. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So Michelle, welcome to Physio Foundations.
Thank you. I do want to highlight that the Deputy Head of Department of Education is now filled with Chantel Hopp. It used to be 2 people, and then during the pandemic, I took over both roles just to help us get through a transition. But now the wonderful and very accomplished Chantel Hopp is the Deputy Head of Education in our department.
Oh, good to clarify, and welcome Chantel to that role, doing a great job. And you're very busy. There's actually plenty
roles
of other stuff I could have read for half an hour all the different roles you're in. So have I missed anything else in my introduction there? Perhaps if you can give listeners a bit of a summary of who you are and what you do and current interests and projects.
Yep, that's a great question. So I am often transitioning my professional identity. Who am I? What do I do in a workplace? So I used to be a cell biologist and became an anatomy educator. And now I consider myself a clinical anatomy educator and education researcher. So I wear a variety of hats related to that. My biggest and proudest role, though, is the director role, not because I'm the director, but because I feel like I'm helping create the future and support the future of clinical anatomy education. And we have some excellent academic staff and professional staff within the center. So that's the role that I'm really excited about.
And it's a wonderful place to work. So I work as one of the anatomy facilitators with Joe Corbett, I'm trying to get on the podcast. He's such a good educator and has such good knowledge. And you work with Joe as Joe coordinates the team that I'm a part of there and I teach into. And it's such a good energy and such a good team of everyone there in that department and in the anatomy team. And then we have some really interesting, good, high quality educators who come in as clinicians and they bring all their recent clinical knowledge in as well. So it's just energy is the best word I can have for teaching anatomy. I've done it since 2010. With you guys there. I just love coming in there and doing it. So
I have this secret belief that anatomy educators are the best educators in higher education.
Not biased at all, but
not biased at all.
What do you love about it?
What do I love about it? I think the challenge. So anatomy, if we think about it in the public, or even as I thought about it growing up, I thought it was super exciting. You literally get to understand yourself and who you are in this world. I mean, who doesn't want to know about that? I remember getting books and going, oh, this muscle and how a fetus grows, or all of these different, children's books on different anatomy. I even had a 3D pull-out book. I loved it. And I also like the challenge in higher education because I think at some point we start to think that anatomy is just memorization and regurgitation. And I get to be the person who hopefully changes the minds of our students. So it's really about understanding and a very physio, I imagine, perspective about the function of the muscle and how that function or the makeup of that muscle impact each other. So how the anatomy impacts the physiology and vice versa.
Absolutely. That's our focus. So our subject is called applied anatomy. And within that, of course, we have clinical anatomy. And that's the focus of these series of episodes I'm planning. And they'll be really just the golden nuggets the take-home messages from learning that anatomy. It's not to learn anatomy again from the beginning, but that's a job that everyone has to go through and do themselves. But that intersection between the structure and the function and the person and the condition that they've come to see you with, it's just endlessly fascinating. So What's your favorite area then? You
Ooh,
teach broadly across anatomy. So we're talking about we're not just talking
yeah.
about musculoskeletal anatomy. We're
No.
talking about systems. We're talking about abdothorax, head and neck, everything, the whole body.
Yeah.
So do you have a
Actually,
favorite region or area of the body, or maybe a topic to teach?
yeah, absolutely. I do. It's interesting that you say that because I also serve on the Royal Australian College of Surgeons anatomy board. And within there, we grade different exams or set different exams, and everybody picks their topic area. And us anatomists are just like, we'll take whatever, you don't want, basically. Because you're right. We do have a broad, maybe not as in-depth within some areas, the specialist areas, but we have a broad understanding of anatomy. But as you point out, each of us have our favorite areas, and I definitely gravitate towards the visceral cavity anatomy and innervation, peripheral nervous system. I think because it's more of a story. I love storytelling. I love the story of how we, if you look at development and then where it positions itself in the adult and all the implications of that. To me, viscera innervation, it is a story, and it's a puzzle that you have to 3D puzzle you have to put together. So I like the challenge of that area.
And the story can be a functional story as well. If you start telling the story, I'm thinking about musculoskeletal anatomy here, where there's the story of muscles that share load through shared connection. I'm thinking about the iliotibial band with its connection into the lateral intermuscular septa and into the linea aspera and to the femur. And the femur isn't straight; it's actually curved because of the forces and loading that go through it. And you can't stop. You just keep talking these stories that are related to the structure.
Absolutely. And Luke, you hit upon something that was eye-opening for me. So on a mini version of the podcast we interviewed researchers, and I learned from somebody that bones, we view them as static things that are unmovable, unshapable. They are actually dynamic contributions to your human physiology. Molecules are coming in and coming out of them. They're affected. It's fascinating. And we can think of that with our teeth. Like if we lose them or we gain them, our whole jaw changes position, which changes positions of our ears, which changes. It's awesome. Everything in our body is dynamic and changeable. And you're absolutely right. The function can be part of that journey and that story of the human body.
And the podcast Michelle's talking about, listeners, is the Ask.Anatomist podcast.
Yep.
So you got to check that out if you haven't seen it. And it had a couple of series, and then COVID happened, and we're hoping it returns.
One day.
So this podcast is a conversational style, and it has content. And your podcast was a sort of a panel, and lots of direct questions that you'd investigate in a panel format. So it was really good for education. You could sort of refer to those exercises. Exactly. I actually stumbled upon one with Mick Storr, who's my colleague that I work closely with in first year physio at Monash, and he did a panel with Mick and some doctors and a patient advocate.
Yep.
So a number of different people. And so that was really useful. So I'm going to segue off the topic here. So what actually got you inspired to do that podcast as an educator? It's a public facing thing versus working with privately inside a university.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is absolutely because of my own journey that I got interested in it. So I remember what it was like to be a patient before I understood anatomy and after, because it wasn't until my postdoc that I even learned clinical anatomy. Most people learn it much younger, or much more junior in their career. And I realized I was better at asking questions, understanding and interpreting what the doctor was telling me because I knew the language that they were using to tell me that information. And I started wondering, why is this a privileged source of information? Why can't we help the community also gain the language and knowledge needed to understand their own body? And that's ultimately where this came from, because ultimately our students are the community at some point, right? They don't have expert knowledge of anatomy till they're through the anatomy. So we tried to target both areas. A subcurrent, which you highlighted in that back pain episode, is the idea that anatomy isn't just for one specialty. It is our understanding of the complex human body depends on diverse perspectives. And everybody has a depth of knowledge. I just gave the example of Rex. Like there are hand surgeons that can tell me about structures that there's no way I would have even been aware of. And it's a constantly evolving area too. So I think a lot of our students think that anatomy knowledge is done. It's in a textbook. It is complete. No, when a person reconfigures, maybe they damage their hand muscle and the surgeon has to go back in, they're still researching what's the best attachment. How do we attach that to get the fully functioned hand movements back, right? That's actually really complicated. The human body is amazing with its attachment sites, how it functions, and there's huge areas of research that are still being undertaken there. And I think that podcast was meant to both help the general public interpret their own clinical situations better and get across the message. Research is still happening in the area, and there's lots of people focused on that area.
So anatomy is so vast.
Yes.
And it's so much of your career or your interest can go into anatomy and you'll never find the bottom. Yeah, and at the same time, it can be challenging, particularly for an undergrad student. I thrived more in anatomy in my postgrad, my master's.
Yes.
I actually really enjoyed it undergrad as well. But I found that it came home for me then as an older student. But there's a new language to learn, and it's vast. So for the students listening, what are your tips as an expert educator for chunking information together, for studying anatomy, for really making it stick?
Yep. I think that I'll highlight a challenge often. So to quote one of my medical students, and this is a brilliant quote, and I guess I also see this as an observation. Medical students, and I imagine many students, are the term they used, completionist. They want to know it all. They want to understand it all. And as you just highlighted, Luke, we don't know it all. There's literally research in this area that's still undergoing. There is depth of anatomy that we as educators are not aware of. So the depth is challenging. My first tip is to listen to your educators. They are setting boundaries on the depth that they want you to go. So I would discourage, especially we saw this in COVID, like I went online and I found this resource, and then this conflicting research. We're telling you the resources we want you to use. We're telling you the depth we want you to highlight. Use that. I think there's a trust challenge, maybe because in the past they've had educators who've tried to catch them out or trigger. I want them to be competent doctors. I want them to be competent clinicians, competent physios. My goal is not to trick them. It's to give them the base knowledge so they can take care of me when I'm old and decrepit, right? So when I'm ill, when I'm coming to you with back pain, which is 40% of your patients, I am not here to prove that I'm smarter than them or that they're not as smart as they think they are. I am here to make sure that they can care for their patients. And so I think that that's the first thing, is to use their educators for the depth. The second thing is to move away from what I opened with, that memorization focus. Anatomy is not memorization. There's a book called 100 Years of Solitude. Very few people have heard of it, but basically it opens up with this family tree that's like 300 people deep. It's like basically anatomy. Here's a book of anatomy. Here's a bunch of names you think you need to memorize and their relationships to each other. It doesn't work. You read the story and you start to know and understand and remember every single one of those names because there's a story behind it. Oh, this is all a part of the flexor compartment. That's why the nerve here is that. That's why. So starting to go from the higher order, the scaffold of anatomy, and then filling in the details. Don't start the other way, because if you understand the story of anatomy, either its function, either its development, whatever story you feel that you align with, then you fill in the details of what those structures are to tell that story. That's a better way than trying to memorize 100 different terms that seem meaningless.
It's a very different position to be in, thinking about a story, and that engagement, you have to be, that level of engagement you need to have to engage at the story level versus the completionist or the gifted test taker who's going to come in and wants to know what's on their exam. And I just can't agree more with you about the statement there, when we're talking directly to students here, that as educators, our job is just to make sure you're competent.
Yeah.
You have the basic competence to go, and the real learning begins when you graduate. There really isn't any skullduggery and trickery going on behind the scenes. And we spend most of our time telling you exactly what will be on your exam.
Exactly.
So listen to your educators and, enjoy the journey. And also a really important point there about the educators, the big role of facilitator and educator is to define the boundaries of your learning.
Yeah. And it turns out it's interesting because we're not going to try and teach you everything. It's not our goal because we assume that you're going to continue to learn. I continue to learn. I learn every day from these surgeons that I work with or from my peers who do research in neuroscience. So the goal is really to give you the knowledge of where you know and where you don't know and how to look that information up. I think if we can give you that and you can work towards that, we've done our job well.
My next question was for the educators listening, what makes a good anatomy teacher? And that's really that's something that you're just talking about there. What else makes a good anatomy teacher or facilitator or tutor?
Yeah, I think the best advice I can give anybody who's interested in teaching is first know who your audience is and where they're headed. Because the lecture or the tutorial or the workshop I give to a medical student is going to be vastly different than the one I give to the physio student, which is going to be vastly different than the science student. And that's what we were talking about. Anatomy is so in-depth and so comprehensive and diverse. What we choose to focus on impacts what you're going to learn, what you're going to take away. And we should match that to where the students are. I think that's number one. If you do that well. And then the second thing, which I think there's evidence for, I just saw a paper about this, passion, man. You got to be passionate about your topic. Students take on that passion. They value that passion. Think of it the last time you listened to, I don't know, a documentary, if they were mundane and just saying this is the best documentary. Nobody watches documentaries for that reason. Do you learn something from a documentary? Almost universally, yes. Are you engaged in a documentary? Almost universally, yes. And the reason why is because there's a story, there's boundaries around the knowledge, and there's passion behind it. So I would say those are the three things.
That's so good. So you're talking to an educator here. And then say you're a student listening to this as well, you can really take something away from that. And now what about for a clinician or a practitioner listening? So we could go anywhere with this at all. This is free time,
Cool.
playtime here.
Yeah.
What principles of anatomy do you feel are most important or interesting? It really depends on on the audience, like you said, on the type of clinician we're talking to here. Let's talk doctors first. So your original trainings at cell biologists, you worked a lot with doctors, and physios need to work with doctors. What if you're talking to a group of GPs or doctors? Principles of anatomy do you keep coming back to with that group?
Yeah, I think with that group, I used to teach a 4th-year course that I both created and then supported when I was in the States. And we had a diverse representation of doctors. So instead of the basic science anatomist, which is a 1st-year course, this was a graduating anatomy course. So we had GPs, we had surgeons, medical imaging, radiologists, physios actually involved, orthopedic surgeons. And it was about, you would teach a pain area. So neck anatomy, for instance. So there's neck pain. What do you need to know for physical exam? What anatomy? What anatomy do you need to know to understand the imaging? What anatomy do you need to know to order that physio prescription? Those kinds of things. The biggest thing that I walked away with from there is that expert clinicians are expert because of a theory called encapsulation theory. And it is a very advantageous and required step in expert development. So this is the idea that basic anatomy is no longer retrievable because you've encapsulated. Think of a pill, right? The pill, inside the pill are all the little, actual medicine, but on the outside, there's this capsule around it. And so instead of taking all the little bits of medicine, you're taking a single capsule. So the ability to break apart that pill and show them all the different steps it took them to get to that answer is really challenging the more expert you get. And that's a huge advantage when you have 15 minutes to see a patient, because you can't go, during this shoulder exam, I'm testing this muscle, this nerve, this. It would take you 45 minutes to go back through the pathway. But when you're a student, you need to understand that pathway. So I would say that the best thing you can do, because you're not going to know your blind spots, you're not going to know where you're not communicating the parts of the capsule well. co-create with students, ask them, what don't you understand? Give them the opportunity to provide feedback before you give the formal teaching. I think that would be my biggest, like, the example I use is one day I was driving to work. I had the dogs in the car. This was in the States, and I was dropping them off at doggy daycare. So I thought, I don't know what happened, but I'm driving and I end up in the parking lot at work. The dogs are still in the back. I can't tell you which road I took, where I turned right. If somebody had said, what roads did you go to get here? I'd been like, I don't know. I just ended up here, because that's encapsulated knowledge. I drove that every day. It's become second nature. But a medical student will want to know, I turned right here. I saw a stop sign that told me to turn left here, et cetera. So it's about figuring out that journey and conveying that journey, not going straight to the end point.
So it has to be two-way. You can't just sit there and didactically deliver content. No. This is a conversation that's happening, which lends itself to... Yeah, because they can ask
you a question like, which way did you turn? How did you get to that point? That's a great point, Luke. Very great point.
It lends itself to the type of teaching that we do, which is small group, casual approach, but serious content, serious effort and everything. But it should be comfortable. Everyone gets to have a say. Yeah. Students presenting, students giving regular feedback. Yeah.
And the huge advantage you have as a clinician is you are on those wards, you are seeing things every day. So if you can partner with an anatomist who maybe has that map more clear and use that clinical knowledge and develop this co-created material that students have informed, where their workshops, their clinical cases, they're working through those maps, those pathways to get to the answer, the diagnosis, or the differential. It would be amazing. Use your expertise. And this applies to all educators. Don't assume you have all the expertise to do teaching well. So I always draw upon people in areas, or like, I am not a clinician. I reach out to clinical faculty and say, tell me a case that you've seen, what's common, what are challenges, et cetera. So a part of effective education is not just depth of knowledge in your field, but it's knowing where your depth of knowledge is limited and reaching out to experts to help support that.
So important. So this encapsulation theory, does this lead to the curse of knowledge, where you know so much that you've forgotten what it's like to not know, and it can lead to a one-way delivery of content. And if you're not aware of the person's perceptions of or understanding of what's going on, can lead to them going through a whole semester and not really understanding what was happening. Sometimes it is difficult with students from different cultural backgrounds, where they directly tell you, well, in my culture, it's when we're encouraged or we're not, it's not the done thing to ask questions. That's tough as well. But again, I think small groups and getting to know the people can really help as well, and break down those barriers.
Providing clear instruction to ask questions. Everybody today will ask, and providing multiple avenues for asking the questions. I think Zoom was challenging. Teaching anatomy on Zoom was very challenging. But the advantage that I wish we could recreate, I'm still trying to figure this out, is the chat function. People felt comfortable sending private messages. Nobody knew they were asking a question. Those kinds of experiences actually opened up a whole opportunity to be more diverse and inclusive of different types of learners who maybe don't want to stick their neck out, have grown up in a different culture where it's not appropriate to do so. And I don't know how to recreate that in the face-to-face. I don't want to lose what we learned, but I'm not sure yet how to merge those ideas.
We're always learning, not just the content of anatomy, but definitely education as well. There's so much in there for us to follow on, different themes and different episodes. And I'm going to launch this series where it'll be mainly me and some guests, and there's lots of good guests that I can get on. I'm going to talk about all these interesting functional and structural relationships, and I'm really looking forward to it. So listeners, if you found it interesting, what we've talked about so far, remember to share the episode and tag me in. So you can tag me in at Luke Periton. You can tag Periton Physio at Periton Physio. And I'm going to put links to all of the things that Michelle's mentioned here in the episode in the show notes, even the book, 100 Years of Solitude. For people to look up. I've written it all down. We've got and we've got your background, your profile, where we can find you, Michelle, and anywhere else that you'd like to direct people to, potentially resources for clinicians or students or educators. Where's a good place to go? Apart from their textbooks, to where's some good resources you direct people to?
That's an excellent question. It's when we get students. I don't have a clear-cut answer other than I can speak to my own experience. I think other people reaching out. I have to tell you, academic Twitter, med-ed Twitter has been an amazing resource for finding expertise or finding resources when you're seeking them. So it's actually one of the reasons that I created the Ask.Anatomist Twitter site, was people can ask questions of the anatomy community and they always get answered with experts who've been using the material that, So I actually don't think there's the one-stop shop for excellent education, but I do think that humans have an amazing feature when we reach out to each other to support that. So I would say Twitter is the resource that I would use. That's probably makes me ancient and inappropriate, but that's exactly.
In terms of being ancient, and this is the exact answer that we got from one of the Monash new grads. His top resources was social media and Twitter and LinkedIn, where. So obviously, the playing field, you can get experts that you would never have access to otherwise. So yeah. And the psychology there is that if you ask a question, people are interested in answering that in a way that you would have to put a lot of effort to get that happening in real life. You'd have to go and actually buy people coffees and find them in universities, and you can find them instantly. People want to answer your questions. MedEd is #MedEd. Yes. And there's also hashtag PT and Physio Twitter. There's all sorts of hashtags related to questions that you might ask and find experts in there. I don't mind that as an answer at all, because you have to be really sort of thoughtful, discerning, and have a good filter with social media, because there's all sorts of stuff on there.
Yep.
But so are all the experts as well, and sometimes you can find things before you even find them in your PubMed or your journal alert search as well. You can find articles as well. So
absolutely.
We've also got askanatomist.com. That's still going, your website?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, our website's still going, and the Twitter feed is definitely still going. So it's a dynamic Twitter feed, and I view it as a source for exactly what you're asking. So when people have questions about anatomy, from anywhere from histology, so microanatomy, all the way to clinical anatomy and everything in between, anatomy education, learning anatomy, tag Ask Anatomist, it will get tweeted out. I often know the professionals to then tag in who might be able to help answer the question. If I don't, then I just tweet it. And every time we've gotten responses, and very, very important conversations that typically end in, there probably isn't one answer, but here's a few options.
That's always the way. It just branches out and explodes. But
exactly.
The point is that you've just got experts from all around the world. Instantly contributing to an answer, which is in such a connected world, and we're so lucky. But you've got to actually use it for it to work. So
absolutely.
Ask at Ask.Anatomist. And then there's your own Twitter at Inside Out Anatomy. I'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, without the E, because they wouldn't let me have. It's why it's not Ask.Anatomist, because there also is a limit of characters there. INSID Out Anatomy.
Yeah. On Twitter. And then, so you've given us lots of good thoughts to go on with, and it really is a key sort of a summary of what you said there in terms of anatomy education. Have that passion and have a story, and the story continues, and there's no bottom to it. There's no end to the story, but then know the boundaries of that story for when you're learning yourself and when you're helping to teach, or when you've got a certain amount of time and as a clinician, you're looking something up. Don't get lost down the rabbit hole.
Yes.
Go and look things up and be focused on why you're looking it up, and then move on.
You are absolutely right, Luke. One of the key pieces of advice that maybe I'll get yelled at for giving, that I give to students, especially when they're struggling, is don't read the book, because it's like an encyclopedia of anatomy. Until you have a question to ask the book, it's very challenging to take anything away from, because the text isn't written to tell the story of anatomy. It is written to provide factual information. So without a really good question to ask it, the oracle of the textbook, I think it can be overwhelming and not necessarily beneficial for the learning. So I'd actually start with the resources the educator provides, and then use the textbook to fill in the gaps, to assimilate the knowledge, to consolidate the knowledge.
Brilliant.
Yeah. I don't know if that'll get me in trouble with the entire education community. Like, don't use the textbook. I'm not saying don't use the textbook. I'm saying use the textbook purposefully.
No, that's what you said. And that's a great analogy of it being similar to thesaurus or a dictionary or an encyclopedia wouldn't sit there reading it. There'd be no story, there'd be no context. And as a clinician, when you do pull out the anatomy book and you look something up and show the person, and you're sharing that learning, and you're actually showing them in a clinical textbook or anatomy textbook, there's really power in that as well. And Brian Kim, one of our grads who was on the new grad series on this podcast, talked about doing that as a new grad. And it served dual purpose of actually looking things up for himself and just real-time education, because you can't remember everything. No one does.
No one.
He would share that education with the patient he was working with, and it's really similar to what you were saying.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Michelle, for a really interesting discussion. I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the anatomy building next semester, all the different levels. So until next time, this is Michelle and Luke wishing you all the very best with your studying, professional development, and lifelong learning.
Thank you so much for having me, Luke.